And so the final years of the Nixon administration were spent in the process of trying to get the United States out of Vietnam. Off and on from 1971 to 1973 was the process of engaging in peace talks, but these were fraught with all kinds of challenges and difficulties. Just getting people to literally sit at the table, and where were certain people going to sit, could take weeks. And so the peace talks would stop and start, and people would walk away and back out, and eventually, around Christmas time in 1972, just after being reelected as president, Richard Nixon, in frustration over these failed peace talks, unleashed the heaviest bombings of the entire war, the Christmas bombings of 1972. There's a lot of controversy about these bombings. The anti-war movement on the home front, which was already enraged, was even further enraged by these bombings. From a humanitarian perspective, these bombings, which were finally taken all the way to the city of Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, and which resulted in many civilian deaths, they were very controversial. They also added more than 100 American pilots to the list of prisoners of war. At the same time, there are those, and some of the prisoners of war themselves in Hanoi, there are those who applauded Nixon for putting the heat on the Vietnamese and North Vietnam and kind of forcing them to come back to the peace table. Regardless of your opinion of the Christmas bombings, in January of 1973, so not too long after those bombings, finally the North Vietnamese agreed to a solution whereby the United States would withdraw all of their troops. Within 60 days after this agreement, both sides would exchange prisoners of war, and the North and South would remain separate, independent entities. And so by March of 1973, the prisoners of war were indeed returned, and the United States pulled out of Vietnam. And the picture that you see on the bottom is the famous scene of the last day of America's involvement in Vietnam, when we were pulling out of South Vietnam, and South Vietnamese lined up by the thousands, clamoring to try to get themselves into one of the helicopters as they left, because the South Vietnamese understood that without the support and backing of the United States, if the North Vietnamese were to invade or take over, that many of those South Vietnamese would be killed for their role in resisting North Vietnam. Indeed, that is exactly what happened. By 1975, North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam. Saigon, the capital city, fell, and eventually Vietnam was unified under communist rule, which is in essence what Ho Chi Minh had always wanted. He was not alive to see it, but that was his vision. As soon as we were out of this conflict, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, which was in some ways designed to counteract the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, or at least to make sure that it wouldn't happen again. There were a number of aspects to the War Powers Resolution, but they were all geared towards requiring the president to have the backing of Congress before committing American troops for any period of time. So if American forces are going to be committed for more than 90 days, the president must have the approval of Congress. So this was one effort to try to make sure that the kinds of things that Lyndon Johnson had done in getting us involved in Vietnam would not happen again. With that, we can begin to discuss one of the most debated and written about questions related to Vietnam, and that is, why did the United States fail? The defeat in Vietnam, or at the very least lack of success in Vietnam, became a real black mark on America's legacy. And a real blow against our military, which up to that point had always met with success. So why did we fail? Well, there are many, many reasons, and in fact entire books have been written about this, so what I will share here are just a few of perhaps the more prominent reasons why we failed. One of them was that in essence the Vietnamese had the ultimate home field advantage. The United States was never accustomed to fighting in those conditions and in that territory, and the enemy knew the land intimately well. They had their network of tunnels, they knew the jungles and all of that sort of thing. Couple this with the fact that the United States fighting force was being turned over at a rate of about 9 months. That was the typical service in country, as they called it. And so American troops were often being sent home just as they were becoming acclimated to the style of fighting. On the other side, the Vietnamese troops fought from childhood to adulthood, and so they were always very familiar with this style of fighting. There is also the related idea of the guerrilla warfare that the enemy fought, hiding in the jungles, surprise attacks, springing out against American forces. Meantime, our troops were much more accustomed to fighting out in the open, traditional style of warfare. There is also the idea of waging a land war in Asia, which may be something of a cliche. Napoleon discovered this, Alexander the Great discovered this, and the United States discovers it during Vietnam. Supply lines are simply stretched too thin. It is simply too far away. Americans are too unfamiliar with what's going on to maintain support. There was also the idea that we never received enough support from the South Vietnamese themselves. Remember, this is the country we're trying to help. These are the people that we are trying to uplift. And yet, what are we doing? Bombing their villages, ruining their fields, dropping chemicals on the countryside, and all kinds of other atrocities. And so many South Vietnamese were naturally inclined to support Ho Chi Minh and the communist side and turned against the United States. And finally, there is the massive protest on the home front. The American government found it more and more difficult to justify and maintain a war abroad that clearly so many Americans simply opposed. And so it becomes harder and harder to maintain a war when almost no one on the home front supported it. So in the final reckoning, we can look at a number of different ways of measuring and thinking about our experience in Vietnam. And this is a page with different charts that are shown in your textbook, so I encourage you to kind of look back at them in a little bit more detail on your own. But you observe the changing troop levels, which show you that phenomenon of the troops peaking in 1968, 69, and then beginning to decline after that. That's the process of Vietnamization. So by 1971 and 72, remember, we're still trying to win the war, but it is under those kind of crazy circumstances of Operation Phoenix and so on. And you see the numbers in terms of anti-war demonstrations in Washington, D.C., and so the massive ones in 1969, 1971. You see some of the totals in terms of numbers who served, 47,415 battle deaths, and so on. You see the numbers of draft evaders. We didn't talk a great deal about that, but that was another phenomenon. You see the destruction in terms of the defoliation in South Vietnam, crop destruction, and so on. And again, that's the people that we're supposed to be helping, and yet we're destroying the jungles, destroying the crops and fields. And then finally, the percentage who said sending troops to fight was a mistake. And you see the steady kind of increase on that chart from 1965 up through the end of the war in 1973. And so as a final thought, we can consider some of the costs of the war and the legacies of the war. And again, you can consult the chart that I showed on the previous slide as well. More than 2 million Vietnamese killed over the course of this war, 58,000 Americans killed. Perhaps most severely of all is the blow suffered by America's reputation as a country. On the one hand, its military reputation. The United States had never lost a major war before, certainly not in recent memory. And so now we have lost to this curious little country of Vietnam. It was hard to believe that we could lose a war like that. But more significant still was the blow to America's reputation as a nation that does right, that does the right thing, and is a nation trying to do good around the world. By the end of the war in Vietnam, the United States was almost unanimously censured and condemned by the United Nations. We were standing alone in our efforts in Vietnam. And as a final thought about the legacies of the war, there is the idea that for many decades the United States determined to avoid similar conflict. This was known as the Vietnam Complex, that the United States shied away from involvement in any kind of conflict that might escalate to become another Vietnam. And finally, there's the thought that Vietnam still lives on in our national consciousness. There continue to be movies made about Vietnam, perhaps most famously Forrest Gump, but we still are familiar with Vietnam. It's a part of our conversation. It shows up in Hollywood and in the media, and we still remember Vietnam.